Joey, mate, I am super excited for today. One of my biggest virtual mentors, Stuart Wemyss, has decided to join us. Firstly, his podcast is one of, like I was just saying this off air, but like if I've got a backlog of podcasts and Stuart's is there, I'm first to listen to that one. So that's the Investopoly podcast. Massive virtual mentor of mine. I listen to him all the time, and he writes the blogs as well, which is kind of, I think it goes one in one with the podcasts. But he's also got two really good books. The first one is Investopoly, which I read, I don't know, maybe 24 months ago, I think, a little while ago. But his most recent one is probably one of my favorite books, which is Rules of the Lending Game. I've actually read it twice. And I love it because it goes into so much detail about the lending game. And as our listeners would know, like, the property, being a property investor really comes down to the finance and getting into lending. So to have that complete holistic understanding of the lending game is so critical. So if you haven't read that, I'd highly recommend it. But outside of that, Stuart also has 20 years of financial services advice. He's very experienced, and he founded Pro Solution back in 2002. He has a Bachelor of Commerce. He's a chartered accountant. He holds many postgraduate qualifications. He's also licensed to provide credit, tax, insurance, and financial advice. But Stuart Wemyss, welcome to the Property Pals, mate.
Thanks, boys. Great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Mate, I would have had the book here. I was going to show it up on the screen to show you because I think I've read Investopoly 3 or 4 times, but I've given it to my brother who's actually on his second trip round reading the book. So certainly getting that one around. And as Jordan said, absolutely love the podcast and couldn't recommend it high enough for our listeners. I mean, for our listeners, we only deal really basically in the property investment space, but Stuart gives well-rounded kind of advice around not only property, but also really great insights into the share market as well. So one for the investor or the all-round investor. And as I said, just one of my absolute favorite podcasts. And I know, Jordan, you love it almost as much as I do.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a good point there. Like us as property investors kind of always have this tunnel vision of just property, but I think Stuart gives a really good overview of investing in general, and the principles kind of apply over multiple segments. So yeah, I absolutely love it. But I guess focusing on the property space, there has been a lot of sort of pent up demand and fear of missing out, combined with those large savings amounts accumulated during that COVID lockdown period, alongside now this access to cheap money. And it almost feels like there's been a bit of a frenzy in the market sort of over the last 2 to 6 months, and those housing affordability headlines start to come up, and all of these articles are resurfacing now about getting impossible to getting into the market. But Stuart, I know you're a big emphasis of the long-term play, and what are your thoughts around sort of overpaying for a property today and its impact on that long-term trajectory?
I wrote a piece for the Australian newspaper recently, and I had a one-line comment that said something along the lines of the price that you pay for a property never ruins ruins the investment, and realized, you got to edit these articles quite substantially. They're about 800 words or something, and there's not a lot you can say in 800 words. And I realized, after I edited that article, that maybe that one sentence might have been misconstrued a little bit. And you have a look at some of the comments on the Australian website. Some people saying, well, of course, the price that you pay for a property is important. So it was taken out of context a little bit to some degree, but and then encouraged me to write another piece, which I think is going to be published this weekend. But the reality is that we don't want to overpay for property, and it's completely unnecessary in most situations. I think it then comes down to, and when I talk about overpaying, I think we need to think about, that in context, because it comes down to really making an assessment of the value of a property. And quite often we express the value of a property in one single number, but it's so subjective that it probably more correctly should be expressed in a range to sort of reflect that subjectivity. So I know I did some work many years ago I wrote an article for another property magazine about property valuations, and I interviewed a couple of property valuers back then, and they said, look, there's an error tolerance range of plus or minus 10%. We can't be that exact. If we're going out and valuing a property, as long as we're in that sort of 10% range, that should be enough. That should work. When we look and overpay, do we really overpay, or do we just underestimate the value of a property? But no one wants to go and pay 20% more or 30% more. That's when I think we're really overpaying, and that's what we need to be concerned with. So my comment was really about, look, if we pay 5% too much, firstly, the question would be, is it too much? But even if we assume it's too much, as long as we're buying the right asset, that's never going to ruin an investment. But of course, we don't want to pay 30% too much.
And Stuart, just quickly, in your experience, do you kind of notice that rhetoric is more common amongst owner-occupiers or investors, or is there no real difference?
I think the rhetoric is more common in inexperienced property buyers. I think people that have deep experience with property. Look, I was saying to one of my staff this morning that you really need to own a property for 30 years to really enjoy the total benefit, the real benefit of owning property. In the first 15 years, you'll get some capital growth, but really on dollar terms, if you look at the total return over a 30-year period, most of it comes in the second half of that 30-year period. That's when it's really going to work hard for you. So you find then that people that have been in property for 20 plus years are far less concerned about price versus value than people that are entering into the property market for the first time. And that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, if you've got a massive asset base already, well, of course, you're less sensitive to, changes in value and price. But if you've got, very little to your name, then you're going to be more concerned about it. But I think what we really need to do is focus on not necessarily price versus value today, but price versus value in 10 years' time, or price versus value in 20 years' time. I think that probably puts it in context a little bit.
That's exactly right. Like, so for example, you bought that property in the 90s and you might have paid 90 grand or 100 grand or 110 grand, but it's still worth $2 million today. So you look back and go, well, does that 10, 15, 20, that 20% even really matter?
Exactly right. But, the problem is that properties always seemed expensive. It's always seemed expensive. I was writing an email to a client this week and reminding myself that I bought a property in Melbourne in about 2006, I think it was, for $723,000. And at the time it set a record in that street, and it was only 150 square meters of land. That property today would be worth north of 1.5, probably 1.6, something like that. And so when I bought it, I looked at it and thought, that's expensive. And it certainly was compared to comparable sales. And also then when you look at, it's only 150 square meters of land, what have I done? Is this thing going to work? So when we make those comparisons, and Joey, you bang on, like if you look back and bought something 20, 30 years ago for 90 grand and you overpaid by 10%, you're not going to care today. But in 20 or 30 years ago, you would have cared. Like 9 grand would have been a big deal to overpay. So that's why I think we find it, most humans naturally find it difficult to make that mental mathematical leap of how could this property be worth so much in 20 or 30 years. But it's not that difficult. It's not that difficult mathematically for the property to be worth that much.
I just love the psychology behind it. And I just really want that to land for all the listeners, particularly if we're appealing to potentially a younger listener. I really just want that to land with you all, like exactly what Stuart said there. He bought that property and look what it's done in that time. He was worried about it at the time, but 15 years later, look what it's done for him.
It's natural to worry. And the ironic thing with human behavior is the older we are, the more longer term we think, and the younger we are, the more shorter term we think. And it should be the other way around, right? Like Jerry Seinfeld has a thing around, why do people so old drive so slow? You've only got a limited of life left. You should be driving much faster when you're older. But it's just making fun of just human psychology. It's dumb, right? If I'm in my 20s, I've got a very long runway. I should be thinking and making long-term decisions, but it's always very tempting to cut corners and try and fast track wealth.
And Stuart, I know,
Sorry, John, go.
I know this is, I know how mathematical you are and how you like, pumping out examples and going through this and, giving you qualifications and everything else that you've got behind you. Has this been sort of your personal philosophy that you've developed over a long period of time? Is it something that you saw quite early? Like, how did you mentally get to the point where you're like, okay, this makes sense and this is what I believe in?
Look, I think it's a combination of personal and professional experience. I certainly didn't have the right mindset in my 20s. My 20s, I bought my first property when I was about 23, I think, and did pretty well out of it, just accidentally more than anything else, rather than by design. In my 30s, I think I was equally impatient. And not focused on fundamentals and wanted to fast track wealth. And it wasn't really till late 30s that I started to really work out that there is no fast track. Well, there is, but it's just as likely as winning Tats Lotto. It's random. You can randomly make the right decision. I think anyone that's invested in Bitcoin in the last 5 years is probably falls into that basket. But for the most part, taking that shortcut almost never works. In fact, I would almost say always never works. People that have invested in Bitcoin over the last 5 years would disagree with that, of course. There's always exceptions that prove the rule. So, yeah, I think it's natural to want to make money quickly when you're younger. It's natural if you've got a very low asset base to want to increase that significantly, and making a 50, 100, $150,000 gain very quickly changes your financial position significantly. And so the temptation is there to do that. If I could talk to my younger self, I'd slap myself around the head and say, no way, just focus on that long game. And ironically, you're probably going to be way ahead in the shorter term anyway. So by focusing on the long run, in 10 years' time, you're going to be probably well ahead of your peers as a result. And 10 years, I don't think is that longer time frame.
No, not at all, especially go, Joey.
Now, is that kind of your horizon? Like, if we were to kind of say, like, what is your kind of, when you kind of say your long-term horizon, what is that? Is that 30 years? Is it 50? Is it forever?
That's a really good question. It's at least 10 years, I think, is the best answer. I guess it depends on the type of investment that I'm making and what the proposition I'm looking at. But I think I get tempted just as much as anyone else, of smaller short-term opportunities. Tech in share markets, for example, is a pretty significant one at the moment, that you get companies that look sexy, that will appeal to the market, and you think, well, should I jump on board? And I say, no, Stuart, there's no fundamentals. It's not making any money. There's no chance of it making any money. Stay away from it. So, and the thing that rings in my ears is in early 2000, through the tech boom, then the boom and bust, Warren Buffett said, look, I'm not in tech and it doesn't make sense to me. And at the time, his comments, he kept saying those comments. At the time, you thought, oh, well, is he wrong? Because technology's pretty significant. And he was bang on, and it only took him a couple of years for the market to prove that he was bang on. That sort of rings in my ears as well. So 10 plus years, I think, is a good time horizon. To invite people to think 30 plus years, it's just too hard to really focus on what life could look like in 30 years' time. But 10 years is long enough to invite you to stick to the fundamentals and not make too many short-term decisions, but not too long that it's difficult to foresee.
I think you may have touched on something just before, Stuart, but I guess contrary to overpaying for a property is this so-called buying under market value or getting a bargain, as some people like to call it. And people that buy these types of properties often wear it as a sort of badge of honor, and they like to talk it over the barbecue property conversations that we always talk about. What are your thoughts on or views on this sort of buying well or buying under market value?
Well, you got to be in the right time at the right place. So it's not a case of not believing or discounting that you can buy under fair market value. You can. So actually, I just remembered that property that I referenced that I bought in Melbourne was in 2006 for 723, and as I said at the time, I thought that was expensive, and it was a record for that street. 2 years later, I bought another property in that same suburb, which was much larger. This is 400 square meters. The other one was 150 square meters. The week after Bear Stearns crashed, so it was at the height of the GFC, and the media, the TV was sort of, saying things like business has changed forever, nothing's going to be the same. It's a financial, everything's been financially decimated. It was just like a very negative time, and I bought it for $1.21 million. At the time, then it was two single-fronted Victorian cottages side by side on 200 square meters each. At the time, in that street, 200 square meters was costing around 800,000 or 900,000. The bank valued it, even though contract said 1.2 at 1.6. That will never happen again today. So obviously, I did well in that. I mean, you had to be in the right time, right place. I went to that auction thinking, look, I'm probably not going to be able to afford it. I don't think I'm in the money here. And no one bidded. It was a terrible time to sell property. So it was still a great asset and still ticked all the boxes. And one of those properties sold in May this year for 2.1. So and I say it sold because I ended up donating those to my ex-wife a few years ago. But the point is, it's still fundamentally sound. And you've got to be in it to win it. So bargains can be there, but I wouldn't base a strategy on it. I'd base a strategy on paying fair market value for a property, because the flip side is, if you're really focused on getting yourself a bargain, what are you missing out on? I'd much rather, Buffett says, I'd much rather pay a fair price for a wonderful company than a wonderful price for a fair company. And it's the same should apply for property. I'd prefer to pay fair market value for an awesome property from a fundamentals perspective than get a bargain for a shit property.
Yeah, I guess that's where I was kind of going with that question, but I think you raised a really good point there as well, as you can still get a really good A-grade property for, under market value or less than it's typically worth by playing out the cycles or going through certain market conditions that'll enable you to do that. So I think that's a great point.
And if I talk to this market, my wife and I would like to buy another investment property this year, but I'm not in a hurry to do so. And not because I'm after a bargain. I'm prepared to pay fair market value. But in this sort of market, it's very difficult to pay fair market value, I think. And, you can get it, though. It might happen. You're still attending auctions, still having a look, still participating. But I'm in no particular hurry. So, sometimes I think it's almost a Tatsloto effect. I had that story of buying under fair market value. I'm probably... I've made friends with the fact that that's probably a once in a lifetime opportunity. It's very random. So that's why I'm saying don't build a strategy on it, because otherwise you'll never buy, you'll never find the right asset, and you'll miss the opportunity.
And when you mention that it's more important that you just buy a good quality asset, like, I know it's super vague, the question, but what's your definition of like a good quality asset?
No, it's really easy to answer. There's three things, I think, an investment grade property, three attributes that an investment grade property must have. The first one is it's got to have a strong land value component. And even apartments, typically older style apartments, will still have an attributable land value content. My sister owns an apartment in Brisbane, and I'm not suggesting people buy apartments in Brisbane, by the way. I think that sector is going to be under pressure for a little bit of time from here on in, but she lives in it. It's her own occupied, but there's 10 apartments, and it's on a massive corner block, like massive corner block. If they redevelop that location now, they would put at least 60 apartments on it, right? So she's got a notional land value of 1/10 of that land. It will work as a result in the long run, just because of the oversupply in apartments in Brisbane. It's not going to work in the short run, but in the long run, it will work. So it needs to have more than 50% of land value because land appreciates and building depreciate.
So
and
before you jump on to the next one as well, I just want to kind of dispel that myth, because it's often, I'm from Sydney, right? So lots of people, particularly in our demographic, are buying apartments. Can we just kind of get your perspective? And are you happy to put a big myth, as in myth busted stamp on this kind of conversation around apartments don't have any real land value? Like particularly if we're talking small boutique 60s, 70s blocks with 12 in them.
Oh, bang on. They have to have that attributable land value because, again, if you just make that sort of mental leap, you say, you look at where the car parking is, that it's not underground, it's surrounding the building or underneath the building. Today they would bury that car park and build more units. It's not a good use of land, but it has much more land surrounding the block of apartments than they would today. So absolutely has an attributable land value. And that's really what's driving it. That's really what's driving the value appreciation, because a 70s block of units, frankly, to my mind, look ugly. So it's not the building, it's not the appearance, it's the actual underlying land value that's creating that value appreciation, and has done for the last 30 or 40, 50 years and will continue to do so. So, but you're right, you've got to look at typically those older style apartments, anything built sort of before 1970s, even maybe 1980s, that, because the building has already depreciated. It's like the new car effect, it has a lot of depreciation in those early years. And then you end up with the remaining structure that once sort of everything's kind of depreciated, and that doesn't really change very much then, because a building's a building. If it was built in the 30s, 40s or 50s, the construction's probably 2 or 3 times better than what the construction is today. And so then that building value might then hold firm, and it's then really the value appreciation. Whereas a new building, a new development, you're lucky to get 10% land value, and 90% of that value is brand new building and developer's profit that depreciates as soon as you enter the building. So fundamentally, it doesn't work. And from my observation over the last 20 years, I've never had one client that's bought a new build apartment and it's turned out to be a good investment. Not even one. So, it's hard to argue with the evidence, really. So that's the first attribute is strong underlying land value component. The second attribute is scarcity. So scarcity in 2 elements. Scarcity in terms of land supply. So you want to buy in an area where there is no land supply. You want fixed supply and increasing demand, because the imbalance of supply and demand is what creates price appreciation. And you want scarcity in terms of accommodation style. And really, that's really aimed at the very large developments. If you've got, another 100 one-bedroom apartments in the same building competing with yours, it's who drops their price first gets the sale. And that's not going to be, it's not going to put you in a position to enjoy capital growth. And the last one is proven performance. The great thing, one of the common disclaimers in the share market is that past performance isn't indicative of future performance, but in the property market, I believe it is. And the reason for that is because the value drivers in property are typically static and factual. Static in that they don't change, or they take many decades to change. So amenities in the area, hospitals, schools, private schools, locality to the CBD or shopping strips, all those things don't hardly ever change. And again, if they do change, they take many decades. And they're factual because they're not open to opinion. How much land size, what's the orientation of land, where is the hospital, how far away from the CBD? These aren't opinions, they're facts. And so if we look at all those attributes that have driven growth in the last 30 years, and if we assume they're going to remain, and I think that's a fair assumption in most situations, then we can get a bit of comfort that if this property is given us 10% growth over the last 30 years, that it's probably going to give us, who knows, maybe it's 8, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 12, but it's going to be something that's going to be a sort of attractive growth rate over the next period of time. So strong land value component, some scarcity, and proven performance.
Stuart, I love that you said that question was easy to answer. I love your confidence in your ability to, hold these fundamentals. And I think that's one of my biggest, reasons of why I continuously listen to you is just this composure to hold these fundamentals and these long-term growth projections and, analysis. But why is it so important? Like, how did you get to that point where you're so confident in what you know and what you understand? Is it through the experience? And why do you, what drives you to sort of generate that content of consistently getting that same message out?
Definitely experience. experience and observation, my own analysis, and my own personal experience in investing for myself, and then also experience in helping other investors. So that's really shaped it. I'm quite analytical, which is a good thing and a bad thing with property, because you can be over analytical with property. I think property is part art, part science. And if you're going to be too scientific and too analytical about it, you'll make mistakes. The reason why I'm really passionate about, because I don't think anyone in their right mind would ever write a book. They're just, every time, the sun is shining, as soon as you decide to write a book, the next weekend after you've made that decision will be a perfect weekend. The sun will be shining, everyone will be out at the beach or, out at the pub or at a restaurant or whatever, and you're at home sitting there writing a book, and it's just moronic. So it's a lot of work. So then I think, well, why the hell would I ever do it? And why the hell would I ever do it multiple times? And the reason can be solidified into a very simple sentence, is that almost no financial mistakes are made as a result of random bad luck. They're all predictable from the outset. Totally believe it. And that's why I wrote Investopoly, because I think that there's only 9 rules that we need to follow, and every financial mistake, if people are sort of contemplating and want proof, they just need to read the book and then think about any financial mistake that they've made in their life, and it will come back to breaking one of those 9 rules. It's very simple. Building wealth is very, very simple. Humans make it more difficult than it actually needs to be. And it's really, I believe, you can adopt an evidence-based approach to building wealth. That is, you can only, if all you do is just take steps that are rooted in sound evidence, that you've got very sound, robust evidence that this is going to work. And that if that's all you do, you'll be very successful at building wealth. It's when people try and invent the wheel, reinvent the wheel, they take a proven methodology and go, oh yeah, but maybe just add this or do this. You only have to be a little bit wrong to be totally off. You've got to get it right. You've got to get it perfect. And you can do that if you follow a rules-based approach towards investing. And so I strongly believe that. I follow it myself. And the more people I can get to understand that, I think the more people that will benefit. And that's why I sort of write weekly and prattle on like this.
And I think that's a perfect segue into the next question that I wanted to ask. And it's a bit of a can of worms. And I know we could probably spend a whole podcast on just this question alone. But what are your thoughts? I know it's heavily debated around the property investment space, around the age-old debate of cash flow versus capital growth. And can you just explain a little bit about the relationship between the two, if you do believe that one exists?
Yeah, so it's like playing, I use the golf analogy, it's like playing golf. You can tee off with a putter and it might work, but it's a lot of work to get there at the end. So then investing in asset allocation. So do I use property shares, bonds, whatever asset allocation I'm contemplating, is really the golf analogy. Which club do I want to pull out of the bag, and which one is the most efficient? So property, to my mind, is a capital growth asset. I don't invest in property for income. In fact, I would prefer to forego a % in income for another % in capital growth. And property suits people that want to build their asset base. And really what you need to do is you need to build wealth in 2 steps. You need to first build your asset base and then tilt towards income. People think sometimes that, hey, I want to stop working one day, I earn an income, so now I need to invest in assets that are going to replace that income. You do, but if you try and do that in one step, it's like teeing off with a putter. You'll get there in the end, but it'll take you 20 or 30 shots and you'll look like an idiot. So that's why you need to do it in 2 steps. And that first step is then capital growth, and property is the best asset for that. Because if you're going to get a 10% return in the property market, you'll typically get 8% growth and 2% income. And you only get 2% income because that 8% growth property is mostly land value. And tenants don't want to pay for land value. They want to pay for location, but not land value. It's a crappy old house on a really valuable parcel of land. It's not attractive to a tenant. What's attractive to a tenant is a brand new apartment that's high spec and fantastic, but that's not attractive to an investor because it's mostly building value. So a high rental yield is a good indicator that you're buying a low land value asset. And it's like buying a new car. It's never going to work out for you from a wealth accumulation perspective. So I don't think you can get both. I think it's very rare that you can get both. I mean, you might be able to buy a really older style apartment and put it on Airbnb and get a high income and still high capital growth. So I guess there's ways of potentially doing it, but just a general aspect, you're always better off to sacrifice income for capital growth. But the capital growth has to be there because there's a lot of low income, low yielding assets that also give you very little capital growth as well, which means you've got to go back to those three fundamentals that I previously just spoke about.
And it's something that we've been saying over and over, Jordan, that like although there's a low percentage yield now, once you've owned that property for 10, 15, 20 years and that debt comes down, your yield on the loan's something stupid after that 15 or 20 year mark.
Yeah, because the rents are continuing to scale into the future and vice versa, right? As Stuart just touched on, like generally, if you've got a high yielding property now, it's because the growth has been so slow, but the rents have continued to increase. So from a yield percentage perspective, it's much higher, but you haven't had that growth. So yeah, I think you're spot on. And I guess, on to the next question based on those 3 points that you said before, and you can use those three again if you want to, but if there were sort of three big picture fundamentals that you wish you knew you had known when you started out building your own property portfolio, what would they be?
Pay for advice. And I know I've got a vested interest in saying that as an advisor, but I'm not necessarily just saying financial advice, but paying for professional advice, almost good quality professional advice almost always pays for itself, or at least it should pay for itself. So if I'm in property, or I'm talking about property, what I'm really talking about is a buyer's agent. Now, there's a whole bunch of buyer's agents out there, and there's a whole bunch that I wouldn't recommend people use. But I think that's probably not dissimilar to really every profession. You've got to find a good one. And to my mind, when you're using a buyer's agent, you want someone that's an expert in the area that you're buying. And so the longer they've operated in that area, the more experience you can lend on. Now, there's two things that a buyer's agent's going to help you with, knowledge and experience. Knowledge is not a big deal. We can replicate knowledge. I can sit on podcasts and Google and read a whole bunch of books, within a relatively short period of time. I can replicate probably very similar knowledge to the buyer's agent, but experience tells us how to apply that knowledge. And what you really want to do is not make a mistake when you're buying a property, and not every mistake is obvious. So I know some buyer's agents will say, look, well, that street's a fantastic street, but we only buy on the north side of the street, not the south side of the street. The south side of the street just doesn't work. It's never worked. Or another story I like to tell is that I was looking at this, one of my family members was looking at this property, great location, great property. It was an apartment, back of the block, good aspect, good floor plan, like ticked all the boxes. Then I rang up this buyer's agent I trust, and they said, no, that property is used as a thoroughfare through to another suburb, and too many cars get broken into in that street. And so the tenant turnover is too high. Well, no book's going to tell me that. No internet search is going to tell me that. And so that's the sort of knowledge that you need to pay for. So if I don't have 20 years or 30 years of experience in buying property in a particular suburb, you need to pay for that experience. And paying for that experience, I look at it as like insurance. It's insurance against making a mistake. And the cost of a mistake could be several hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars. And so that makes a lot of sense. So probably the biggest thing is if I don't know what I'm doing, that's when I'm probably at my most risky, and the best way to reduce risk and ultimately increase returns is paying for advice. And that's what I strongly believe. Of course, there's a point in time when people gather their own advice and their own experience, I should say, and they don't necessarily need as much help. But certainly starting out, it makes sense. But you've got to find the right buyer's agent, and that's not always easy to do.
I love it, mate. The wisdom you have is absolutely ridiculous. You're so insightful. You're so methodical. You're so, you've got everything. You're always full of examples and scenarios and mapping these things out. I really appreciate the work that you do in the space, and please keep it coming, because I learned so much from you. And again, I just really appreciate everything. I love you coming onto the show today and taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been fun, and I enjoy, as you can probably tell, I enjoy talking about finance, wealth, and property. So it's a pleasure.
Stuart, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Stuart.
Well, good.